Moving on to the pure Power BI solution, which in many ways is actually simpler, but there is one important trick that I have to use, which I'll be showing. To begin with, I need to transform data from a web page. And as I showed in the Power Query solution, I want to create this, the standard view, and then a view where I've swapped around weapon 1 and 2 so I can stack them, meaning I have duplicate collabs and every single weapon in the first column. Which means I simply want to take the standard view and swap the names of these around, and I need the placeholder for the second column, and I can change this column. And then I can do my append, where I want to do that on the standard view, but it should not refer to swap, it should refer to standard view. And then append, and I want to append it to itself, and then I'll change it afterwards. So I don't want to append, I want to append. Yeah, and now it deleted my step, so that was a bit annoying. But it's fine, I change this to standard view, and this also means that weapon 1 will be on the left. And you can see here absolute wall, and then absolute wall, cutting board and bounce ball and cutting board. And then I want to add one more thing, which is just an index column, because I'll need to use this later on, so I can refer to the first time I find absolute wall. This would be TBL collabs, and this is the one that has duplicates. Then I also want a table where I only have the unique weapons. So I want to remove other columns, and then I want to remove duplicates, which I can use to create a relationship. So I can say, hey, for this weapon, which collabs are available? And then I also want a version of the collabs that has no duplicates. And then I guess I don't need the index column, but I don't want to then also remove it. And lastly, I also want, just as I have only the weapons, I also want only the collabs. I'll need this later on to create an inverse slicer. And I need this to be disconnected from the actual table. And I actually want that to be the no duplicates version, because I only want one, I only want the collab to show up once. And that was everything I needed from Power Query. And it tried to be nice and create relationships, but I don't actually want it to create this relationship between only collabs and TBL no duplicates, because I need this to be disconnected to be a slicer. We'll see that soon enough. Don't want that either, because I want a one-to-many from the weapons and flowing down to the collabs and the collabs with no duplicates. So this should be active. And this was a case where Power BI wanted to be nice, but it actually made everything worse. But this is fine, because the first page I want to make is where you have a weapon you select, and then it'll show you all the collabs available, which means I want my all weapons, weapon 1, and I could use I could use the weapon type here from weapon 1 as my slicer, because it's the same information, because this table has been duplicated, so I have every weapon in this. But I'm choosing to use this as sort of a bridging table, because then the filter will flow down on both tables in case I need information from both. Yeah, so now that needs to be a slicer, not a table. And we can make it look a bit nicer by making it a list. A tile is what it's called. And because the filter flows down, I can just go ahead and say I don't want weapon 1, because I have that from my slicer here. I want the second weapon that I need and the name of the collab, and then a tag type and description. So this was very, very nice and easy, and that automatically updates. And then I want another page that does the inverse. I want to have a slicer where I select my collab, and then it'll tell me what weapons I need. And here I don't want any duplicates, because I want both weapon 1 and weapon 2 and not the two swapped around. And because my collabs table is disconnected, I can't use that as a filter. Well, I could, but then I'd need to make a measure, and that seems a bit overkill. And again, I want that to be, I should have made that a slicer. I want that to be tiles. And here there's a bit of a problem because there are so many. So I need to drag it down to have all of the collabs visible. And again, it's as simple as weapon 1 and weapon 2 and type and description, because I select the collab over here. And you could select multiple if you wanted to, but the point is to say, well, how do I get the specific collab I want? Well, you get that with BL Book and PsychoX. And then I want a page that will act as the slicer for the next pages, which means I want to have here on the sync slicers, I want to have one slicer that acts on the next 4 pages. So this will act as my unlock list. And the idea is that you go onto this page to say, well, what collabs have I unlocked? And this is where I want to use my table that is disconnected, because then it doesn't directly filter, it only filters based on the meshes that I'll make. And it should be a slicer. And right now it's then visible on one page, and I'll say that it should affect other pages. So if we just select a couple, it won't do anything if I drag in any of these columns, because there's no direct filter, because they aren't connected. Then I want simply a page that says, we'll go into this slicer and say, which have I selected, and then grab the related information. When I want to make a measure saying, well, how many have I unlocked? I simply have to create a new measure and say that the number of unlocked collabs is then equal to count rows. And right now I haven't set that the filter should affect this page. So this should be 23, which it is. But once I go in here and say that this slicer should then affect the unlocked collabs page, and I don't want it to be visible because you're only supposed to go in here to change it, then this will be 5. And I can then also calculate the inverse. So how many do I still have remaining? That would be a count. Well, actually it should be a calculate count rows of the only collabs table in a filter where I just remove the filter on only collabs. And then I should say minus the number of unlocked, which should then be about 17 or so. 18, yeah, because there are 23 in total. So now I have those two, and then when I go in here to say, well, I've also unlocked Dragonfire, well then these two should update. Yeah, and it would help if I remember to say that it should actually affect this page. So I needed to click this check mark, and now the slicer is connected, I guess. On this page I want to show the collabs I've unlocked. So I'll start out by just saying weapon 1 and weapon 2, and then the collab and the tag type and description, so all the information. But I then need to create a measure that asks, can I find this collab within this list, because the two aren't connected. And I don't want to create a connection because I need this to create the inverse slicer. Conveniently, there's a function that lets me test if this collab value can be found within this list, because this is actually then a filtered version of the column itself. So when I've applied this filter, these 7 values is what you get from this table. So this table is filtered down to only 7 rows. And I can then ask, well, can I find this value within those 7 rows? Which is then to say, can I find it in slicer? So if, and now it's being stupid with the intelligence. So if the max of my collab, and I need to do this because I don't have row context right now, so I need a function that can then turn my filter context into one value, which I do by saying max, because when I look in the row in tbuild collabs no duplicates that has the collab BL Fujoshi, that is only one row. So when I use max, I only return one row. So I can say, can I find this value BL Fujoshi inside all of the selected values that I have in the only collab table? And if that's true, I want to return 1, and if it isn't true, I want to return 0. So right now I have my 23 collabs, and when I then add this, I will get 1 and 0, and I want to keep those where the value is 1, because that means I can find it within here. So absolute wall and BL Fujoshi, I want to keep those. Absolute wall and BL Fujoshi, and So everything with a 1 in it, I want to keep that, which means I can drag my measure over to my filter, and that's why I wanted to use 1 and 0 instead of text, because I can just, well, I could make it text, I guess. I could change this to be keep. Yeah, and I was right. Yeah, it only wants you to say is a number, but I guess you could say like is not blank and then make this the text keep if you really want to for some reason. I had a comma and I wasn't supposed to. So if it isn't empty, so I will just turn that back to 1 and 0 because I prefer that. And again, this gets mad, but we can update it. Say I want to only keep those rows where the value is 1. But it really doesn't matter which method you use. So these are all of the unlock collabs, and then I want also the remaining collabs, which is then the inverse of what I've done so far, which is also exactly what I have to do. I then have to ask the opposite, is it not within the all selected? So I'm going to copy this so that I keep the slicer, the sync slicer. Well, it should work. Yeah, it's carried over when you duplicate, which is very convenient for me. And I guess I can delete those two, which means I simply want to make the inverse. And actually, because my function works the way it does, I can actually just say, well, if it is in all selected, then it's 1, and if it isn't in all selected, it's 0. So I don't have to make a new measure that simply says if it's not in this, because that actually gave me an issue with saying that you're not allowed to do this. So that was very convenient, and I didn't realize that when I made the video, but this is actually way easier. I don't have to make another measure, which I did. And I did not come up with this solution. This was one I got from this video from BI Elite. Power BI exclude selections in a slicer, where he says how to do it. And he uses he creates the table within DAX, so within Power Pivot, where he simply creates a new table, which is the values from this column. But I prefer doing it with Power Query because then it's loaded before I get in here. So everything has been calculated. That's just my preference, because I find that when I make a table in DAX, which is, for example, values, it ends up giving me a circular reference when I try to make connections, which makes sense, I guess. And I don't actually need to have this as a column within my table, because I can apply it as a filter, even though it isn't shown in the rows. And the same here. So that should be remaining. And there's one more page I want to show, which is to take this table, which has my remaining collabs, but I want to show the grouping based on weapon. So for instance, I have Elite Lava Bucket and Elite Lava Bucket. That means I have two collabs where I need Elite Lava Bucket. So it can tell you which weapon should you focus on. Based on weapon, how many remaining collabs are there? And I also got this from an answer from the community for Microsoft, which was, I think it was this solution, which again is I want to do a filter based on the all selected function, but I want to do the summarize also. So I want to make a summary of the table based on the weapon 1 column, and then I need to also use all selected as a filter, which is exactly what I'll do. And in this case I need the duplicates so that I have all the weapons in weapon 1, or I could use weapon 2, it doesn't matter. But I want to do a count exclusive, and then for good measure I'll put in the answer. And I want to first make a variable which has my selections inside my slicer, because I think it is a bit easier to understand once I get there, which is then simply the function all selected. So it's not a big chunk of code, but I do think it will make it easier to read. And at least it was easier for me to understand. So I want to calculate a count rows of my TBL collabs, where I then apply the filter on TBL collabs, which is that I don't want to have any row in this table that I can find within TBL collabs collab within selected collabs. And the trick for me was that you can't just say not in, you have to do like this, where you say not parentheses in selected collabs. So yeah, it's code that's very easy when you're not the one who has to write it and figure out how it works. And then I can just say weapon 1, if I could drag this, and then my count exclusive, which I don't think I did a duplicate, which means that this collab has not been added as a filter. And now it works. So then you can sort this to say, well, I should really focus on these 4 weapons because I have 3 collabs with them. Or inversely, you can say, well, I should focus on these 2 because then I'm completely done with them and I don't have to use them to get all the collabs. So depending on how you like playing, I guess. And it turns out I didn't need to use summarize, which I thought I did. In order to do my grouping, I could just do this, which is a lot easier. So yep,